is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an Advanced Cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. I've often said on this podcast and when leading events that most of tasting is just about slowing down and paying attention. Every food and beverage has a few of its own little processes and rituals involved in sensory evaluation, but 90% of it is the same no matter what you're tasting. Take your time and listen to each of your senses, paying attention not only to what they're physically telling you, but to what emotions, memories, and imagined images they bring to mind. My colleague Mandy Naglich has written a book that explores how our senses interact with food and beverage, and how understanding our senses can help us better enjoy our favorite indulgences. How to Taste, a guide to discovering flavor and savoring life, combines science and whimsy to teach us more about our sensory world and bring our favorite flavors to life. Mandy is a fellow Advanced Cicerone, as well as a Certified Cider Professional, an Aroxa Certified Taster, a National Homebrew Competition gold medalist, and holds a Level 1 WSET certification in spirits. She tastes widely and adventurously and shares her experiences with us in this book, which comes out June 27th, the day this episode goes live. I talked recently with Mandy about some of the amazing things she experienced and learned while writing and researching the book, how we both approach the tasting process, and why tasting with other people can be so impactful. We tasted a beer and a chocolate together, and she also read a couple short passages from her book. Listen in as we talk with Mandy Naglich about her book, How to Taste. Mandy, thank you so much for coming on Bean to Barstool today. We're going to discuss your book, How to Taste, a guide to discovering flavor and savoring life. And at the outset, I would love to know why you wanted to write this book. What led to writing How to Taste?
First of all, thanks so much for having me. I've been listening to your podcast for a while, so it's exciting to be here.
Awesome.
And really, I mean, the topic of your podcast is one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book. I think, we're both trained with backgrounds in beer, but so much of tasting has overlap, whether it's going into chocolate, honey, cheese. And one of my good friends, she's a certified cheese taster, and she told me, oh, being a Cicerone, that would be so cool. I could never do that. And I was like, actually, with your background, I think you certainly could. So I think I was just inspired. There's so much crossover. I've been so lucky to work with so many different professional tasters or just food professionals. And I realized all of our expertise crosses over so much. And there was never really a book that kind of connected that as a basis of just being a taster, as opposed to a wine taster, a whiskey taster, a honey taster, things like that. So I really wanted to show, once you get to know your senses, it really opens up the world of everything, not just your specialty.
One of the things I think I've noticed for myself is the more expertise you gain in a particular area, the more respect you have for all tasters in all other areas. Like before I tried to become a Cicerone, an Advanced Cicerone, it didn't even occur to me that of course there must be trained honey tasters and trained chocolate tasters. It just wasn't in my field of vision at all. And then suddenly it's like, oh, of course, every one of these fields must have extensive training.
Yeah, and even down in Mexico, they have a very extensive certification process for tasting just agave spirits. It's like, wow,
Awesome.
even beyond a spirits taster, you get so specific and can do years of training. So it's really cool.
Well, reading through the book, you had some really amazing experiences, people you got to taste with, interviews you got to do, places you got to eat. Can you share some of the most indelible and striking images that you're going to hold on to after this process?
That's a good question. Yeah, because I interviewed over 100 people for the book, and just a small sliver ended up in there. I would say one that really was exciting for me. I've always been a fan of darker spirits and whiskeys and bourbons, and so getting to talk to Logan Haynes, who was on the Buffalo Trace tasting panel, who basically decides, yes, this barrel's going to be Pappy Van Winkle and this barrel's just going to be standard Buffalo Trace, I thought was really cool, to be one of those palates that's like, this is the rarefied liquid, getting to talk to him. And the coolest thing about it was so much of our background and training was so similar, like the way that we get trained to taste beer was very similar to the way that he was certified to be on that tasting panel. So it definitely led me into confidence of the book that I was following the right topic and like on the right track.
What were some of the things that surprised you most that you learned? Maybe things that were a little counterintuitive, things that you hadn't even thought about. What were some of those surprises?
I think something which I have to say I haven't found a scientist to fully back this up, but multiple cheese tasters, and Brian Gilbert sticking in my head, talked about heavier molecules kind of falling back to your nose at a different rate. So that's why when you kind of move something as you're smelling it, how the aroma might change specifically because of like the molecular weight of different chemicals. And I never really thought of it. And so that was something, I've been thinking about chemical compounds and flavor for so long. And then that totally makes sense that that would be correct. But that really stuck out to me as something that obviously there's someone in that industry training that way, and it's something that they all hold true. And I think it totally makes sense. So another reason to have that kind of moving sniff that I talk about in the book.
That stood out to me as well. I'm
Mhm.
aware of those different processes, and sometimes I get kind of lazy and think like, oh, this one can't really be that critical right now. But one thing that I thought was interesting that I learned from your book, or at least wish I had learned a lot earlier on, when I first took the Advanced Cicerone exam, I passed the written, I didn't pass the tasting the first time. And I realized that I didn't understand what my control sample was really for on those different tasting panels where you have a control beer and then you have a spiked sample. I was always using it as a comparison. Let me just smell both of these and see which one is different. And you talk specifically about the control as being basically to intentionally make your nose anosmic to the control so that what's in the spiked sample will stand out to you as different. Was that always your understanding, or was that something you learned at a specific point?
That that wasn't always my understanding. I was saying going into advanced, I didn't know that. I did learn it going into master, and I actually learned it from someone who did QC at the time for Brooklyn Brewery. That was just like just sit there with your nose in the control and sniff until you can't smell anything, and then go to your panel. And that's yeah, exactly. I was lucky to do very well on my tastings for Master Cicerone.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
read in the book you were 1 point away.
Ooh, yeah, and it's funny because it was on food pairing that I basically failed. So, but you read about my philosophy on food pairing, so maybe that's why. But yeah, the control sample, and the same thing when I went to Tillamook and got to work with their quality assurance people about how they do tasting. It's exactly the same. They just sit there and have the cheese in their mouth. This is what we're looking for. If anything sticks out in the next thing that I taste, that means it's off. As opposed to trying to look for a match or something like that.
One thing that I always bring up when I'm leading tastings is that it's inaccurate to call it a tasting. We're engaging all of our senses in this process. And that's something that you hit very heavily throughout the entire book. This isn't
Mhm.
really about how to taste, it's about how to engage all of our senses in the process of enjoying food or beverage. There is a section early on in the book where you're talking specifically about how sounds and music and color influence our perception of basic tastes and of the flavor experience overall. You mentioned that loud noises can dull our perception of salty and sweet. For whatever reason, jazz seems to improve our enjoyment of food, all these different things like that. Have you been able to use any of those to kind of manipulate the tasting experience when you're leading events or even just for yourself? How consciously are you able to employ those principles when you're doing this for yourself or for other people?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about doing it for events, but maybe I need to come up with a playlist for the book events I'm about to head out on. But I think the biggest thing for me has been thinking about it in restaurants and especially bars. If you're maybe going out to a nice dinner, there's a restaurant I talk about that's right across the street from me here in New York called Crown Shy, and they are fantastic, but they do have a loud kind of thumping playlist. And I think that's more of a time to get some cocktails and have that with dinner as opposed to maybe buying a really nice nuanced bottle of wine where we might want to be able to first of all hear ourselves discuss it a little bit more, and second of all maybe not be as affected by that background music. So I think that's more what I'm thinking of. What am I going to purchase where? I think, since COVID and being able to eat outside, I think it's actually really nice to order a nicer bottle of wine or something, maybe a neat pour of a more expensive bourbon outside where it's a little quieter, and you can really partake in the experience and focusing on your tasting, whereas when you're kind of shoulder to shoulder people at a bar, maybe that's not the best time to indulge as far as your pocketbook.
When you're tasting something at home, do you find yourself kind of playing with those knobs of, sound and music and color and setting and all those different things? Or do you kind of have your set way that you're going to taste something at home?
Definitely, I'm all about clearing the space. I would say no music when we're really tasting at home. I've been doing a series of tasting with people who come over, just tasting different cocktail elements. Like we did a big vermouth tasting. I got like 16 people to weigh in, and now I'm doing triple sec. And it's funny, someone who came over, he was like, "Is this what you do at home? You just stand around and like taste things, and you put a white, I have like a little white kind of tablecloth I put down when we're all tasting together." And he's like, "You just have this here?" And I'm like, "It is what I do at home." Yeah. I'm sure you feel the same. Like it's just a fun thing to do. Whenever I have someone over, I'm always like, all right, let's do a quick blind tasting just to see what your palate's like. So yeah, it's definitely something, especially learning all these things. If I want to be able to say this is a good blind sampling of what people think of these different vermouths, I try to get the setting as ideal as possible for them to really give a real taste evaluation as opposed to here, smell this, taste this, what do you think kind of thing.
So we are that friend in our friend groups.
Definitely. It's good to
One
have
of
us
the,
around.
yeah, right. Most of the time, at least. Hopefully, it doesn't get annoying. I don't know.
Yeah.
You have one section where you're talking about taking a moment to visually appreciate whatever it is you're about to taste. A lot of times that gets mentioned as a way of building anticipation or even providing information for what you're about to taste. You specifically make the point of visual appreciation is its own part of the sensory appreciation process. Just taking a
Mhm.
moment to appreciate how this looks is a way of enjoying it, not just a way to prime us for what we're going to taste. You had this great sentence in there where you say, whatever you're tasting, it will never be more beautiful than it is right now. Like that last
Mhm.
moment before you take a bite, you take a sip, whatever it is, that's the most visually beautiful it's going to be. Can you talk a little bit about that visual appreciation component and maybe how that fits into your own experience with food and drink?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This fifth issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
Yeah, I think it probably does blossom out of beer for sure. We are lucky to specialize in a medium that has this like beautiful head. It has so many different components compared to other things that are poured into a glass. So appreciating, the brewer was able to create this mousse that stays. I love like the line between head and then where the beer starts and the color, the visual contrast there. But I also think chefs, everyone works very hard to present something in a way that's beautiful. Even a chocolate bar, after your first bite, it's not the whole thing that it used to was. It's not as glossy. It has your fingerprints on it and things like that. So I think it's great to appreciate something as it was made to be presented. But I also make a point to say, don't let visual cues mislead you. I actually think some of that priming elements can be misleading and change the way that we think about flavor. So I try to in the C step, I try to say it's more like appreciating art as opposed to beginning the flavor process necessarily.
Well, with that in mind, why don't we go ahead and taste a beer together? We've
Yeah.
selected a beer that might be more storied than just about any other, or at least their marketing department would hope that we believe so. We'll see. They proudly spangle across all of their labels that they are the world's oldest brewery. Can you briefly share with our listeners the beer that we're about to taste?
Yeah, we're doing the Weinsteffen Hefeweißbier. So a wheat beer, a German wheat beer. Like you said, from the world's oldest continuously operating brewery, I would stick in there, but that doesn't look as nice on the
Right.
labels. But definitely as classic as you can get for this German wheat beer style. Yeah, I'm excited. Like I told you before we started recording, I haven't had this one in a little while, so it's good to dive into a classic.
Yeah. What is your relationship to this beer? Do you have any specific memories tied to it?
Yeah, I mean, I've visited the brewery twice out in the hills just outside of Munich, which definitely is a game changer. Once you walk into the brewery when they're literally brewing this beer and you can smell the cereals and everything, and it's just that very potent grain cereal mash forward aroma. I think now every time I smell it, it really takes me back. First of all, the room was extremely hot. It's very different. The Stafy standards they have in German brewery tours are very different than when in America, where you're looking through a glass panel. They let us get right up in there on the mash tun. But yeah, I definitely have a memory of that. And then going to the tasting after I was the only American on the tour. It was all Germans, and pouring this beer and having the guy next to me grab my bottle and swirl the yeast and pour it on top for me and say, now drink it.
That's awesome.
So yeah.
We're going to be over there in November. We're going to be going through Bavaria. We'll be in Munich a little while. I haven't decided exactly where we're hitting, but I'm hoping to run out to Weinsteffen. We'll see.
It's a great day trip. The little town is very, very cute too, and there's lots of bear statues around and a great ice cream parlor. So if you
Awesome.
go, you'll have to let me know. I'll give you the tips.
Yes, I will definitely take you up on that. So I obviously have not been there. I feel like there has to be a word, probably in another language besides English, for like the memory of a place you've never been. And I
Mhm,
feel like when I am drinking this style, especially from a classic German producer, I have a picture in my head of what I think it would be to be sitting in a German beer garden and tasting it. And
mhm,
that's kind of what comes to mind whenever I'm tasting one of these.
mhm.
So normally, if we were pouring this whole thing out, we'd be putting it in a nice tall Weizen vase. I am going to be tasting out of something closer to a Tiku glass. It's not exactly that, but sort of like
I
a,
have a Tiku too.
there we go. Is this your favorite tasting glass?
It's up there, definitely. I actually do a lot of tastings out of just like the universal white wine glass. Feel like it creates a nice base that you can get pretty much everywhere, so you're kind of tasting everything equally. But
And
Tiku's
how
great.
much you do talk some about glassware shape in the book? How much for yourself do you subscribe to the importance of the shape of the glass specifically for aroma analysis?
I really think as long as it's in a glass, even if it's a shaker pint, I think you're good. I
Yeah.
really don't think it makes that much of a difference. I know we want to believe, the tilting of the rim, and I do think it does do something, but the amount that you're going to enjoy your drink, especially if you're not analyzing it, I think is almost non-existent. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't always like to admit it, but that's probably true. The one thing that I do like about glassware is going back to that visual appreciation. I do love kind
mhm.
of the etiquette and the ritual of different glassware and those different pours and how different beers will show up in different glass shapes and that sort of thing. But yes, from aroma and flavor, it probably doesn't matter as much as we all want to think.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, if you have a glass that you think is beautiful and makes you feel special when you're drinking something, go for that one. It's not gonna like affect the flavor all that much.
Yeah,
So
yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's go ahead and smell and taste our beer. Everybody listening
yeah.
just gets to listen to us sniffing a whole
Or
bunch.
different sniffs. I know in the book I'm outlining I think it's like 7 or 8 different sniffs you do at this step, but this one just changes so much for me as it comes in closer and you're kind of taking longer aromas. I feel like you don't get that spice cloviness right away, but then kind of as you're sitting with it, it really opens up a lot.
Yeah, I feel like that banana is what hits right away.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and obviously, I am not a scientist to be able to say anything about molecular weight specifically, but I would
Mhm.
imagine that ester is probably more volatile than the phenol is creating that clove. So you're getting that isoamyl acetate much more
Yeah,
volatilely out of the glass.
go for my first sip. Yeah, but it's amazing because in the actual flavor, in the like taste of it, it's much more balanced, that banana and the clove. I feel like you get it, especially on the end, you get that cloviness. But definitely an isoamyl acetate forward example of the style.
Yeah, they are open fermenting there, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that always surprises me with well-made examples of Hefeweizen is just how light and relatively mild even the flavor intensity is on the
Mhm.
beer. The aroma is much more boisterous than it actually ends up playing out on your palate.
Yeah, and this one, the finish is so clean. It's like just a tiny, ending of bitterness on this, and then it's really, off of your palate. Where I would say some American examples of this style they kind of linger a little bit more, almost with like that heavy cereal
Mm,
sweetness. And this is really very clean and lovely.
yeah.
I'm jealous you're gonna go visit. I need to come.
Yeah, I feel like fermentation forward beers are the hardest thing for American brewers to master, or at
Hmm.
least the most rare that I find a really fine example brewed here. So that's
Hmm.
true both with most Belgian ale styles and these German wheat styles. The
Hmm.
basic aroma and flavor might be right, but the handling of that yeast to where that you got the attenuation and that fermentation character hasn't gotten just turbocharged, I
Right.
feel like is the what I run into most often with American examples.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely the balancing of like the grain bill as well with the yeast character. Sometimes they feel like they need to go a little heavy because the yeast character is so boisterous. And I feel like then you end up with that kind of weightiness on your palate that isn't there in the more European brewed examples.
When are you most likely to reach for this beer?
I feel like it's a great like rooftop summer outdoor beer for sure. Maybe not like a sporting event, but more just like hanging out, maybe pre-grill or just I'm lucky to have a rooftop here on my building. So sometimes in the summer, you get home long before the sun sets from the
Mhm.
office. So you get to go upstairs and have a rooftop beer or two before it gets dark. And I think it has a lot of like sunshine quality to it. I feel like,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know how much of that is learned
Hmm.
connotation because I know what my relationship to the beer is. I know what the beer is for. I know what
Hmm.
that setting would be versus how much of that is intrinsic to those flavors. Like how much do those flavors just kind of imprint that way on our minds? What are some of your works or rituals that you employ in the tasting process that maybe aren't the textbook things that you're going to put in the book? Like, what are some of those things that you find yourself doing that maybe aren't what you would teach?
I mean, I think everyone has this a little bit like when you're kind of getting into the zone, what you do. And I definitely, first of all, I love sparkling water as a palate cleanser, which is not always available. But I like to sit and like have a couple sips of my palate cleanser and take a few breaths before I get started and really kind of like get into my zone, my tasting zone mentally. I know a lot of people say they like taste with their other hands when they're trying to focus. I
Mm.
typically don't do that. But yeah, I would say it's basically just I like a little meditation moment before I get going and kind of I do like this I think it's 3 breaths normally and then I take 3 sips and then go. But yeah, I guess it's funny to like actually think about what I do. It's more of like a body memory thing than like a something I describe verbally very often. But
Yeah.
I think what I outlined in the book, I mean, you read chapter 4 goes pretty specifically into even like how many inches away I hold the glass and things like that. So I really laid it all out there, all of the quirks. I think some people might think retro nasal tasting is a little bit of a quirk, but everyone I've done it with from all different specialties has really liked it. So stick to plugging my nose and taking those extra steps to really get that retronasal flavor.
Yeah, it's something that I have incorporated in my professional tastings, and because I feel like it's really the only way to give a demonstration of how scent and taste work together. Like
Hmm.
getting people to understand that you are smelling what is in your mouth. You're not done smelling it just because now you put it in your mouth. Like I
Right.
feel like going through those retronasal steps are really the only way to make that tangible for people. Otherwise, it's just kind of an abstract
And I
explanation.
do feel like it's different, when you're sitting here, we're smelling, even though this is sitting on my table now, I can still smell the beer from here. And it's kind of like playing the scales on a piano and you're going up, 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 and that's like your orthonasal olfaction. And then I really feel like focusing on that retronasal, it's like almost you're playing the exact same keys, right? It's all the same compounds. So they just come through in a different order. And just like how a scale going down, it's the same notes, but it's just obviously on its head. I do feel like sometimes you pick something up differently doing that. Something seems a little more strong, or maybe a top note you don't get as much, and you get some of those secondary flavors and things like that. So I do think it's a little turning your normal aroma what you're picking up on its head.
That's a good way to describe it. You have one section in the book where you are at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, Dan Barber's Michelin-starred restaurant, and you are tasting a carrot. First of all, can you set up a little bit about the legend of this carrot before we talk about it?
Yes. So Blue Hill somewhere I'd always wanted to go. But then the episode of Chef's Table on Netflix came out. And then I really, really wanted to go because they really show you, inside the kitchen, his whole philosophy of how he's building flavor into his produce and his meat on his farm and how he really starts with flavor before he even starts growing something. And Ruth Reichel is on there and she, says, I had this carrot and it was the carrotness of carrots. And I was like, oh, I want to know what the carrotness of carrot is. And they show this carrot. It's alone on a plate. It's a white plate, but it's matte. So it doesn't like even look like a normal dining plate. It looks like a pedestal almost. And I was like, I have to know what this carrot is going to be. I was like so excited. Yeah, I mean, it's very bold to just serve a vegetable in front of someone. And this is now probably 6 years ago almost. So that's even before now we're a little more used to like showcasing these vegetables as their own thing and thinking about flavor from the farm. But this was very like out there at the time.
The thing I was thinking about as I was reading this, that specific phrase, this is the carrotness of carrot, and you have in there like a saying like I am carrot, as describing itself, is how much that extends to other things. Like, is there a beer that you think of that is the beerness of beer? Is there a wine that is the wineness of wine for you? Like, do you find yourself kind of having a resting place of this is the platonic ideal of whatever?
That is a good question. I don't think there's a beerness of beer just because as we know there's so many different styles, but I do think within each style there is this is like a Duvel is like the golden strong aleness of golden strong. Like there that is what it should be. Same with I would say Saison DuPont, even though that might not be my favorite Saison, it is like the iconic one. Same with wines. I mean, wine is not my specialty, but like this is going to sound, I'm sure wine experts are going to hate this, but like for me, Whispering Angel is like the rosé from Provence. Like that is what it is. Even though there's better and worse examples, that's kind of like the platonic ideal. I think the carrot's a little different because basically what Dan is saying is like there's not that extra water. Your grocery store carrots, how sometimes they'll like literally have water in the bag of baby carrots with them and stuff because they're just bulking them up to look big and there's not a lot of flavor there. I think that's the difference. Whereas something fermented like wine, spirits, beer, chocolate even, that's such like a crafted process to draw something out of the ingredient rather than leaving things behind like extra water or salt or things like that.
Well, there's a section in the book where you are talking about the role that tasting with other people plays in our appreciation of food and drink and our understanding of it. And I would love if you'd be able to read one of the paragraphs from that section. There's a section in here called Sit and Synthesize. It is after we've gone through all of the other technical tasting steps that you've outlined. And now we're done and we're sitting here with other people and we're going to discuss what we've tasted. I would love if you could read that paragraph for us.
Okay, yeah, and I will say I also just got physical books for the first time, so this is exciting.
Yeah.
We can sit next to each other while we conduct a 6-step method and determine what we are each personally tasting. This 7th step is the conversation that comes afterward, the discussion of what we sensed and how our personal flavor world relates to your companions. Sometimes these conversations feel like fortune telling. We agree that coffee tastes like chocolate because it makes sense that it would taste like chocolate. Sometimes, though, there are these moments when you hear the right word for what you're tasting and it's like a shock goes through your system. You can viscerally feel that it rings true. In my classes, people are just learning to think about what they taste. They sniff and swirl and sip and sniff again, hesitant to say anything at all. Words like caramel and toasted bread are met with polite murmurs of support, but not true agreement. Eventually, someone says in a volume just above a whisper, soy sauce? The rest of the class erupts. Yes, yes, soy sauce. It's like a collective exhale. It's as if for a moment we spoke with one another telepathically. We feel absolute certainty that there is less that separates us than we originally thought, a moment of collective revelation from a simple sip and sniff of beer.
I really like that sentence. We feel absolute certainty that there is less that separates us than we originally thought. I think that is the most powerful part of tasting with other people. And it's something that I try to encourage when I'm doing group tastings is that we all say, oh, we have different palates. It's something that gets repeated a lot. And
Mhm.
I feel like more importantly than we have different palates, we have different memories, we have different life experiences, we have different cultural backgrounds, geographical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, all sorts of different things that have influenced our flavor catalog and lexicon. And I think that sitting down and tasting with other people can be a really powerful means of empathy and cultural
Mhm.
exchange and personal exchange and vulnerability, because if we can make it safe for each other to say what we are thinking of when we're
Mhm.
tasting, even if I don't know what that is, even if it's not a soy sauce experience like you bring up where I
Mhm.
instantly recognize it, if you're willing to say what it is and I don't know it, I can ask you what that is. I can ask you
Mhm.
why you know what that is. You can tell the story of when you first tasted or smelled whatever it is. And I think that can be really, really powerful. And I feel like it was really important that you brought that up in the book.
Yeah, there was I talked to one of like the foremost coffee tasting experts. She is the coolest. But she was saying she was tasting with someone from Russia and he was, I think it was Russia. And he kept saying lala berry. And she was kind of glossing over it and she was like, I don't know what this means. So we're going to continue on with the class. And finally she was like, show me a picture of a lala berry. Like, what are you talking about? And it was just an American, what we would consider a blueberry. It's the exact same
Mhm.
thing. And she said, she realized she was like, oh, I need to start when I hear something instead of being like polite when I'm teaching something or just, letting the person I don't really understand. You dig into that and realize even more you're tasting the exact same things. And she's like, so now I put that on my flavor wheels and things for class just in case someone identifies with a lala berry and has no idea what a blueberry is. So it really does, yeah, bring that connection. And that was one experience she had that now lala berry ends up on her flavor wheel forever. So it's kind of cool how we can influence each other.
That's great. And there is so much vulnerability around that for people, especially. I mean, you talk multiple points in the book of people who are new to this are
Mhm.
so vulnerable and insecure in being able to share what they think they're smelling, what they think they're tasting, because they're afraid of being wrong. They don't want
Mhm.
to, they don't want the teacher to politely say, oh, okay, and then move on to the next thing.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so digging in one way can almost like make that a little harder for just a moment because the person thinks
Mhm.
they're being questioned. But like as you make that safe for people, you're actually investing more in the thing that they're experiencing and making that more tangible and real. Well,
Exactly.
let's go ahead and taste a chocolate bar together. So we have Rocca's Bananas Foster bar. Rocca is out of Brooklyn, New York. This is a 66% cacao dark chocolate. Rocca is unique for not roasting their cacao beans. There are only a few bean to bar makers in the country that do this. Chocolate Conspiracy out of Utah, we had on the show a couple months ago, Rocca and just a couple others. It is not as profound a difference as some people might expect, but
Mhm.
it's definitely unique. So one of the things I love about Rocca's bars is their mold. When you look at
Right.
the bar mold, it's got these, you could kind of interpret it different ways. I see them as like rolling hills or mountains. I guess you could see it maybe as water.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
it's got a
Looks like a
really,
map.
yeah, it's got a really cool mold on it.
Yeah.
And one thing I love about chocolate tasting, we talk about engaging all of our senses in anything we're tasting, but in some cases, like with beer, we don't really use our sense of hearing that much. Like it is
Mhm.
involved, but I love that chocolate actually has its own listening step where you get to snap the chocolate and see
Mhm.
how good the temper is. It's a fun little ritual. I think we did that at the same time in
Yeah.
turn. So if we go ahead and smell this one of the things we were talking about before Mandy and I started recording is that we didn't plan this, but both our beer and our chocolate have strong banana aromas. So it's going to be interesting to see how context changes our perception of that. One of the things you mentioned, I think you bring this up in the book. You talk about attendees to your classes sometimes smelling a beer and saying this smells like beer. And
Mhm.
I feel like that's true for pretty much everything. I've found that to be especially true with chocolate because
Mhm.
the context of whatever flavors we're getting is entirely wrapped up in chocolate. Whatever the nuances are, chocolate is that overriding thing. So initially everybody always says chocolate. And I
Do
feel
you
like
have a spectrum, like beer, I'll say, okay, well, if you think it smells like beer, can you tell me, does it smell more close to like pizza dough or burnt bread or something like that? And kind of like give them a spectrum to go on. Is there one that you guys use for chocolate?
I don't know if I wouldn't say that there's not one that is like agreed upon. I mean, I
Hmm.
will start breaking that down into broadly understood things like milk chocolate, dark chocolate, white chocolate, just like,
Hmm.
brownies, things like that
Yeah.
that people would recognize. But the biggest thing is helping people like say, okay, yes, chocolate, check mark.
Hmm.
What is the next thing? Like once you've kind of acclimated to that, what is coming after that?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
I feel like the banana on this, at least in the aroma, is like a little bit brighter, maybe like a little even riper or something than the one that you're getting from the beer.
Mm-hmm. I feel like
Mm.
as you're tasting this, it really starts to come across like almost overripe banana.
Hmm.
Like it's very sweet.
Yeah.
And I guess with the Bananas Foster idea, like it is a little more like that caramelized, oversweet, overripe banana.
Yeah, it's just amazing when you get nice chocolate like this, like obviously compared to something like a Dove, like just how bright everything is. You feel like
Mm-hmm.
chocolate's kind of like this heavy, sweet, syrupy, but like this is, it's probably a combination of the banana as well, but just so like I feel like the word is like zingy on my
Mm-hmm.
palate. Like it's not sitting in there like, like some kind of, like you said, brownie or fudge or something. It's really bright and quite light. It's really good.
Yeah.
I
And there's
wonder, do they say what makes it Bananas Foster? It
I
feels,
believe they are actually using
it almost feels like a
um,
little salty to me. Not
burnt
salty, but like,
sugar, vanilla
oh,
bean,
burnt
and
sugar.
bananas.
Okay, interesting.
I get a pretty good amount of acidity from this, from the
Mhm.
cacao. Like that obviously is going to help with that brightness and that
Mhm.
sharpening of the flavors. But also, I think that plays in to this being unroasted as well. Like this
Mm.
cacao is a little closer to being the cacao that was on the plant, even though it's undergone the fermentation and all that. That roasting hasn't taken it that next step of refinement, so you're still getting a little bit of that kind of sharpness to it.
Yeah, yeah, like almost like a fruitiness to it. It's interesting. I just tried a sip of the beer with this, and I think it's something I kind of talk about in the pairing book. Like we said, these both have banana flavor to them. But I kind of feel like when you have them together, it almost like flattens out the chocolate instead of
Yeah.
uplifting it. It almost like kind of deadens that flavor instead of enhancing it, which is interesting. Not really what I was expecting, to be honest.
This wouldn't be a pairing I would put together
Yeah.
for people. Generally, with Hefeweizen, dark chocolates they get their brightness rounded off, and the dark chocolate
Mhm.
just kind of really thins out the beer.
Yeah.
I usually pair something like this with white chocolate with inclusions. So
Mm.
something like a white chocolate with a coffee inclusion would work really well with a beer like this.
Yeah, I could see that. The creaminess and like richness of a white chocolate would definitely be nicer. But still two good things separately.
Yeah.
So we can't be too upset about
Yeah.
that.
It's interesting. Both of these, if you were just to pick one word, banana is what jumps out, but it's such
Mhm.
a different presentation of banana in both cases. Well, going from the high-mindedness of tasting, one thing that amused me in your book was you have an entire page devoted to how to spit. There's a sentence: if you're going to be spitting in front of others, you should practice, which, out of the context of the book is just a hilarious pull quote. But you actually give guidance in there, like, here is how to shape your mouth to spit, here's how to
Yeah.
practice in the shower. How much work did you put into developing the perfect spitting technique for tasting?
I have to say, I actually practiced a lot because I think I'd say in there about how the first time I tried to do it, I kind of like dribbled and it like ended up on my shirt. And I was like, because you do, if you want to be tasting, I was tasting as for consulting, you're going to be drinking a lot and you do need to be spitting, especially if you're doing something like bourbons or whiskeys or things like that. And so, yeah, I kind of like spit up on myself a little bit like a baby. And I was like, okay, I'm never going to do this again. And I went to a somm that's my friend and asked, like, because they'll spit across like the table and hit a spit bucket. They're much better than me. But like, how do you do it? How do I get where I can kind of aim spitting into my kitchen sink that I'm looking at right now and spitting in the shower? Like two ways to do it. And I think it's another thing. People are embarrassed or nervous, and so they don't do it because it feels like a weird thing to do in public. But once you practice it, it's a great thing. Highly recommend. It's not offensive at all to people who are making the spirits or wines or beers. It's letting you enjoy things a little bit more. So I'm all about very pro spit.
The point at which I realized I was officially like a middle-aged beer writer was that last year I started spitting out my samples at GABF. Because you're at a session for 4 hours and tasting all these beers. I'm like, this is going to be useless after a little while.
Exactly.
So yeah, I was being very selective with the ones that I actually drank. Well, I'm going to have you read one more paragraph for us.
Okay.
This is in a section where you are tasting teas at the Jin Fun Tea Shop in New York City. You're with a tea master, and she is having you taste all these different teas, and one of them is from trees that are 800 years old. And you have a great paragraph after this that just kind of condenses all the gravity of recognizing what you're tasting. Can you go ahead and read that for us?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, and if anyone's in New York and wants to taste anything, even if you're not a fan of tea, I highly recommend this class. It was a game changer. So it goes. At the risk of sounding dramatic, I have to say that I couldn't take a sip right away because I had a bit of a knot in my throat. Without being able to explain it exactly, I knew what she meant. The tea smelled of brown and green at the same time. There was a scent of rich clay, like earth, but with springtime sun showers and freshly sprouted grass. It was a cup of bewitching contradictions, and the only way to describe it was to say it smelled like 800 summers, 800 winters, 70,000 rain showers, hundreds of thousands of sunbeams swallowed up by a tree and given to me in a cup. This short story about the age of the tree that provided the tea leaves, combined with her succinct description of what I would taste, made the cup unforgettable.
I think it's moments like this from the book. One common counterpoint I feel like we can get from a lot of folks is, why do you have to make tasting so technical and go through all these steps, and doesn't that take the fun out of it? But you have these moments like that in the book where it highlights that like being able to give your senses the attention they deserve can give you these moments that you'll never forget. That was one that really stood out to me. Were there any other examples from the process of writing this book? Not just who you got to talk to or where you got to be, but a specific sensory experience that you had that really stood out to you?
I think one that, and it's before writing the book, but one that I talk about is the experience of eating crab brain for the first time, which I think, I also talk about my theory of off flavors and how there are no off flavors. There's just flavors and their context. And I wouldn't say that crab brain was a particularly pleasant flavor, but I literally asked for something that I'd never tasted before, and he certainly delivered it. And it's something that I'll never forget. It's definitely in, my flavor vocabulary forever. But I think to your point, when you said, people say, do you have to get so technical? I think people who are making the things that we're eating and drinking spend so much time and get quite technical to create them for us. So shouldn't we kind of reciprocate that on the other side and take a moment in a little bit of technicality to really appreciate what they've done? And, you start to be able to pretty quickly see what is great and what is just good. And both things are fine, but, you start to appreciate that. And I think that's something I really learned from this book, was it doesn't have to be we're only focusing on the bottle of champagne that's super special. It's like when you go to McDonald's in Belgium and have your stroopwafel McFlurry, that's just as something that you're never going to taste again, and you should take a moment and remember your trip. So I think that was something that really wasn't a huge theme when I started reporting it, and then by the end I was like, I think this is one of the most important takeaways.
Well, your book comes out the day this episode is releasing, June 27th. So everybody can go and pick up their copy wherever they are purchasing books. Mandy, how can people follow you?
I'm Drinks with Mandy pretty much everywhere. And then everything about the book is at howtotastebook.com. So that has book events, some fun posts about people who are featured in the book. Yeah, any updates about the book itself will be there.
Yeah, I saw a few places in the book where you actually have some like visual graphics or like different things that people can interact with on the site as well.
Yeah, there's some stuff from the like scientific studies that Especially, I suggest everyone goes and sees the sniffer cam footage of the martini glass. It's very, it's shocking, I think, like when you actually see what it looks like, aroma coming off a glass. So those kind of resources are there too.
Well, what's next for you after this book? Do you have a project you're excited to jump into?
I'm not sure. I'll put it out into the world that I would love to turn the book into something visual, whether it's for streaming, TV, something like that. I've had the pleasure of working with History Channel a little bit recently, so that's the big dream for next. But immediately I'm hitting the road on tour, and we're going to do tastings all over the place. I have some dates in Connecticut and already up in Portland. I'm going to LA this fall, so that's the immediate.
Yeah. Congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, and good luck with what's next.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so cool to bring beer and chocolate together. It's been a blast.
Mandy's book is peppered with fun little facts about tasting, the kind of things you can't wait to share the next time you're hanging out with like-minded friends. There's also a great chapter toward the end called What Tasters Know, where she somewhat rapid-fire runs through wisdom most experienced tasters in any field will gain over time. One such observation I particularly appreciated was titled, There is Good in the Bad. When you become an expert in a given field, that doesn't mean you only taste the absolute best that field has to offer. Quite the contrary, in fact. The more you devote yourself to an area of tasting, be it beer, cheese, wine, or something else, the more likely you are to appreciate every strata of that segment. Wine experts will have their favorite boxed wine, cheese experts their favorite supermarket cheese, beer lovers their favorite gas station six-pack. Becoming an expert taster isn't about becoming a snob. It's about getting as much enjoyment as you can out of this thing you love and helping others around you do the same. Thanks to Mandy for coming on the show today, and to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.